Cynical theories, how activist scholarship made everything about race, gender, and identity, and why this harms everybody. The Introduction by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. During the modern period, and particularly in the last 2 centuries, in most Western countries, there has been a broad consensus in favor of the political philosophy known as liberalism. The main tenets of liberalism are political democracy, limitations in the powers of government, the development of universal human rights, legal equality for all adult citizens, freedom of expression, respect for the value of viewpoint diversity and honest debate, respect for evidence and reason, the separation of church and state, and freedom of religion. These liberal values developed as ideals, and it has taken centuries of struggle against theocracy, slavery, patriarchy, colonialism, fascism, and many other forms of discrimination to honor them as much as we do, still imperfectly today. But the struggle for social justice has always been strongest when it has cast itself as the defender of liberal values universally, insisting that they must be applied to all individuals, not just to wealthy white males. It must be noted that the general philosophical position that we call liberalism is compatible with a wide range of positions on political, economic, and social questions, including both what Americans call liberal and Europeans call social democratic, and moderate forms of what people in all countries call conservatism. This philosophical liberalism is opposed to authoritarian movements of all types, be they left-wing or right-wing, secular or theocratic. Liberalism is thus best thought of as a shared common ground, providing a framework for conflict resolution and one with which people in a variety of views on political, economic, and social questions can rationally debate the options for public policy. However, we have reached a point in history where the liberalism and modernity at the heart of Western civilization are at great risk on the level of the ideas that sustain them. The precise nature of this threat is complicated, and it arises from at least two overwhelming pressures, one revolutionary and another reactionary, that are waging war with each other over which illiberal direction our society should be dragged. Far-right populist movements claiming to be making a less desperate stand for liberalism and democracy against a rising tide of progressivism and globalism are on the rise around the world. They are increasingly turning towards leadership and dictators and strongmen who can maintain and preserve Western sovereignty and values. Meanwhile, far-left progressive social crusaders portray themselves as the sole and righteous champions of social and moral progress, without which democracy is meaningless and hollow. These, on our furthest left, not only advance their cause through revolutionary aims that openly reject liberalism as a form of oppression, but they also do so with increasingly authoritarian means, seeking to establish a thoroughly dogmatic fundamentalist ideology regarding how society should be ordered. Each side in this fray sees the other as an existential threat, and thus each fuels the other's greatest excesses. This culture war is sufficiently intense that it has come to define political and increasingly social life through the beginning of the 21st century. Though this problem on the right is severe and deserves much careful analysis in its own right, we have become experts in the nature of the problem on the left. This is partly because we believe that, while the two sides are driving one another to madness and further radicalization, the problem coming from the left represents a departure from its historical point of reason and strength, which is liberalism. It is that liberalism that is essential to the maintenance of our secular liberal democracies. As we've previously written, the problem arises from the fact that the progressive left has aligned itself not with modernity, but with postmodernism, which rejects objective truth as a fantasy dreamed up by naive or arrogantly bigoted Enlightenment thinkers who underestimated the collateral consequences of modernity's progress. It is this problem that we have dedicated ourselves to learning about and hope to explain in this volume. The problem of postmodernism, not just as it initially rose in the 60s, but also how it has evolved over the last half-century. Postmodernism has, depending upon your view, either become or given rise to one of the least tolerant and most authoritarian ideologies that the world has had to deal with since the widespread decline of communism and the collapses of white supremacy and colonialism. Postmodernism was developed in relatively obscure corners of academia as an intellectual and cultural reaction to all of these changes, and since the 60s it has spread to other parts of the academy, into activism, throughout bureaucracies, into the heart of the primary, secondary, and post-secondary education worlds. It has, from there, begun to seep into broader society to the point where it has backlashes against it, both reasonable and reactionary, have come to dominate our socio-political landscape as we grind ever more painfully into the third decade of the new millennium. This movement nominally pursues and derives its name from a broad goal called social justice, which is a term dating back almost 200 years. Under different thinkers at different times, this term has taken on various meanings, all of which are concerned on some level with addressing and redressing social inequities, particularly where it comes to issues of class, race, gender, sex, sexuality, and particularly when these go beyond the reach of legal justice. Perhaps most famously, the liberal progressive philosopher John Rawls laid out much philosophical theory dedicated to the conditions under which a socially just society might be organized. In this, he set out a universalist thought experiment in which a socially just society would be one in which an individual given a choice would be equally happy to be born in any of the social milieu of an identity group. Another explicitly anti-liberal, anti-universal approach to achieving social justice has also been employed, particularly since the middle of the 20th century, and that is one rooted in critical theory. A critical theory is chiefly concerned with revealing hidden biases and under-examined assumptions, usually by pointing out what has been termed problematics, which are ways in which society and the systems that it operates upon are going wrong. Postmodernism, in some sense, was an offshoot of this critical approach that went its own theoretical way for a while and then was taken up again by critical social justice activists of the 80s, 90s, and who, incidentally, very rarely reference John Rawls on the topic. The movement that takes up this charge presumptuously refers to its ideology as social justice, although it alone seeks as though it alone seeks a just society, and the rest of us are all advocating for something entirely different. The movement has thus come to be known as the social justice movement, and its online critics refer to it for brevity as SOCJUS, or increasingly wokeism, or the woke mind virus, due to the belief that it has awakened others to the nature of societal injustice. Social justice, a proper noun with capital S and J, refer to a very specific doctrinal interpretation of the meaning of social justice and means of achieving it while prescribing a strict, identifiable orthodoxy around the term. Although we are reluctant to seem to concede the essential liberal aim for social justice to this illiberal ideological movement, this is the name by which it is known, and so for clarity's sake we will refer to it as social justice, capitalized throughout the book. Social justice in the lower case will be reserved to describe the broader and generic meanings of the term. Let us make clear our own social and political commitments. We find ourselves against capitalized social justice because we are generally for lowercase social justice. It is becoming increasingly difficult to miss the influence of social justice movement on society, most notably in the form of identity politics or political correctness. Almost every day a story comes out about somebody who has been fired or canceled or subject to a public shaming on social media, often for having said or done something interpreted as sexist, racist, or homophobic. Sometimes the accusations are warranted and we can confront ourselves that a bigot whom we see as entirely unlike ourselves is receiving the censure she deserves for her hateful views. However, increasingly often this accusation is highly interpretive and its reasoning tortuous. It sometimes feels as though any well-intended person, even one who values universal liberty and equality, could inadvertently say something that falls foul of the new speech codes with devastating consequences for her career and reputation. This is confusing and counterintuitive to a culture accustomed to placing human dignity first, and thus valuing charitable interpretations and tolerance of a wide range of views. At best, this has a chilling effect on the culture of free expression, which has served liberal democracies well for more than 2 centuries, as good people self-censor to avoid saying the wrong things. At worst, it is a malicious form of bullying and one institutionalized a kind of authoritarianism in our midst. This deserves an explanation. In fact, it needs one because these changes, which are happening with astonishing rapidity, are very difficult to understand. This is because they stem from a very peculiar view of the world, one that even speaks its own language in a way. Within the English-speaking world, they speak English, but they use everyday words differently from the rest of us. When they speak of racism, for example, they are not referring to prejudice on the grounds of race, but rather to, as they define it, a racialized system that permeates all institutions in society, yet it largely is invisible except to those who experience it or have been trained on the proper critical methods that train being able to see it. These people sometimes refer to themselves as being woke, meaning awakened to it. This very precise technical usage of the word inevitably bewilders people, and in their confusion they may go along with things they wouldn't if they had a common frame of reference to help them understand what is actually meant by the word. Not only do these scholar activists speak a specialized language while using everyday words that people assume incorrectly that they understand, but they also represent a wholly different culture embedded within our own. People who have adopted this view may be physically close by, but intellectually they are worlds away, which makes understanding them and communicating with them incredibly difficult. They are obsessed with power, language, knowledge, and the relationship between them. They interpret the world through a lens that detects power dynamics in every interaction, utterance, and cultural artifact, even when they aren't obvious or real, which thus makes this an occult practice. This is a worldview that centers social and cultural grievances on aims to make everything into a zero-sum political struggle revolving around identity markers like race, sex, gender, sexuality, and many others. To an outsider, this culture feels as though it originated on another planet, whose inhabitants have no knowledge of sexually reproducing species and who interpret all our human sociological interactions in the most cynical way possible. But in fact, these preposterous attitudes are completely human. They bear witness to our repeatedly demonstrated capacity to take up complex spiritual worldviews, ranging from tribal animism to hippie spiritualism to sophisticated global religions, each of which adopts its own interpretive frame through which it sees the entire world. This one just happens to be about a peculiar view of power and its ability to allegedly create inequality and oppression. Interacting with proponents of this view requires learning not just their insane language, which is in itself challenging, but also their customs and even their mythology of systemic and structural problems inherent in our society, systems, and institutions. As experienced travelers know, there's more to communicating in a completely different culture than learning the language. One must also learn the idioms, implications, cultural references, and etiquette, which define how to communicate appropriately. Often we need someone who is not just a translator, but also an interpreter in the widest sense, someone savvy about both sets of customs to communicate effectively. That is what we set out to provide in this book, a guide to the language and customs that are presently widely promoted under the pleasant-sounding moniker social justice. We are fluent in both the language and culture of social justice scholarship and activism, and we plan to guide our readers through this alien world, charting the evolution of these ideas from their origins 50 years ago to the present day. We begin in the 60s, when the group of theoretical concepts clustered around the nature of knowledge, power, and language that came to be known as postmodernism emerged from within several humanities disciplines at once. At its core, postmodernism rejected what it called meta-narratives, broad, cohesive explanations of the world and society. It rejected Christianity and Marxism. It also rejected science, reason, and the pillars of the post-Enlightenment Western democracy. Postmodernism ideas have shaped what has mostly been called theory, the entity which in some sense is the protagonist of this book. In our view, it is crucial to understand the development of theory from the 60s to the present day if we are to come to terms with and correct the rapid shifts we have been experiencing in society ever since its inception, and especially since 2010. Of note throughout the book, theory and related words such as theorist and theoretical with a capital T will refer to the approach to the social philosophy that stems from postmodernism. Cynical Theories explains how theory has developed into the driving force of the culture war in the late 2010s and proposes a philosophically liberal way to counter its manifestations in scholarship, activism, and everyday life. The book charts the development of the evolving branches of cynical postmodern theory over the last 50 years and shows that it has influenced current society in ways the reader will recognize. In Chapter 1, we will guide you through the key ideas of the original postmodern ideas in the 60s and 70s and draw out 2 principles and 4 themes that have remained central to the theory that followed. Chapter 2 will explain how these ideas mutated, solidified, and were made politically actionable in a set of new theories that emerged in the 80s and 90s, which we will refer to as applied postmodernism. Chapters 3 to 6 will delve into each of the following in more detail: post-colonial theory, queer theory, critical race theory, and intersectional feminism. 7 will look at the relative newcomers, disability studies, and fat studies, which draw on all these theories. In 8, we will explore the second evolution of these postmodern ideas, beginning around the 2010s, which asserted the absolute truth of the postmodern principles and themes. This approach we call reified postmodernism, as it takes the assumptions of postmodernism to be real, objective truths, the truth according to social justice. This change occurred when scholars and activists combined the existing theories and studies into a simple dogmatic methodology, best known as social justice scholarship. This book aims to tell the story of how postmodernism applied its cynical theories to deconstruct what we might agree to call the old religions of human thought, which include conventional religions, faiths like Christianity, which made our world, the Western world, what it is, and secular ideologies like Marxism, which destroyed the Soviet Union and any country that's tried to apply its insane ideas, as well as cohesive modern systems such as science, philosophical liberalism, and progress, and replaced them with a new religion of its own called social justice. This book is a story about how despair found new confidence, which then grew into the sort of firm conviction associated with religious adherence. The faith that emerged is thoroughly postmodern, which means that rather than interpreting the world in terms of subtle spiritual forces like sin and magic, it focuses instead on subtle material forces such as systemic bigotry and diffuse but omnipresent systems of power and privilege. While this newfound conviction has caused significant problems, it is also helpful that theory has become increasingly confident and clear about its beliefs and goals. It makes it easier for liberals from the political left, right, or central central to get at these ideas and counter them. On the other hand, this development is alarming because it has made theory so much more easily grasped and acted upon by believers who want to reshape society. We can see its impact on the world in their attacks on science and reason. It is also evident in their assertions that society is simplistically divided into dominant and marginalized identities and underpinned by invisible systems of white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, ableism, and fat phobia. We find ourselves faced with the continuing dismantling of categories like knowledge and belief, reason and emotion, and men and women, and with increasingly pressures to censor our language in accordance with the truth according to social justice. We see radical relativism in the form of double standards, such as assertions that only men can be sexist and only white people can be racist, and in the wholesale rejection of consistent principles of non-discrimination. In the face of this, it grows increasingly difficult and even dangerous to argue that people should be treated as individuals or to encourage recognition of our shared humanity in the face of divisive and constraining identity politics. Although many of us now recognize these problems and intuitively feel that such ideas are unreasonable and illiberal, it can be difficult to articulate responses to them, since objections to irrationalism and illiberalism are often misunderstood or misrepresented as oppositions to genuine social justice, a legitimate philosophy that advocates a fairer society. This dissuades too many well-intentioned people from even trying. In addition to the danger of being labeled as an enemy of social justice, and this comes with criticizing the messages of the social justice movement, there are other two obstacles to effectively address. First, the underlying values of social justice are so counterintuitive that they are difficult to understand. Second, few of us have ever had to defend universally liberal ethics, reason, and evidence against those claiming to stand for social justice. They have, until quite recently, always been understood as the best way to work for social justice. Thus, once we have finished making the underlying principle of social justice theory comprehensible, we will move on to discuss how to recognize and counter them. In 9, we look at the ways in which these ideas have escaped the bounds of academia and are impacting the real world. Finally, in Chapter 10, we will make a case that we should counter these ideas through a clearly articulated mass commitment to the universally liberal principles and rigorous evidence-based scholarship that defines modernity. With luck, our last two chapters will show how we might write the last chapter in the story of theory, its hopeful, quiet, and inglorious end. This book is therefore written for the layperson who has no background in this type of scholarship, so-called scholarship, but sees the influence of its own on society and wants to understand how it works to counter it. It is for the liberal, to whom a just society is important, but who can't help noticing that the social justice movement does not seem to facilitate this and wants to be able to make a liberal response to it consistently with integrity. Cynical Theories is written for anyone from any part of the political spectrum who believes in the marketplace of ideas as a way to examine and challenge ideas and advance society and wants to be able to engage with social justice ideas as they really are. This is not a book that seeks to undermine liberal feminism, activism against racism, or campaigns for LGBT equality. On the contrary, Cynical Theories is born from our commitment to gender, racial, and LGBT equality, and our concern that the validity and importance of these are currently being alarmingly undermined by social justice approaches. Nor will this book attack scholarship or the university in general. Quite the contrary, we seek to defend rigorous, evidence-based scholarship and the essential function of the university as the center of knowledge production against anti-empirical, anti-rational, and illiberal currents on the left that threaten to give power to anti-intellectual, anti-equality, and illiberal currents on the right. This book, then, ultimately seeks to present a philosophically liberal critique of social justice scholarship and activism, and argues that this scholarship activism does not further social justice and equality aims. There are other scholars within the fields we critique who will be derisive of this and insist that they are really reactionary right-wingers. We are really reactionary right-wingers opposed to studies into societal injustice experienced by marginalized people. This view of our motivations will not be able to effectively or honestly survive the reading of our book. More scholars within these fields will accept our liberal, empirical, and rational stance on the issues, but reject them as modernist delusion that centers white, male, and Western heterosexual constructions of knowledge and maintains an unjust status quo with inadequate attempts to incrementally improve society. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, they will tell us. To them, we can see that we are far less interested in dismantling liberal societies and empirical and rational concepts of knowledge, and much more interested in continuing the remarkable advances for social justice that they have brought. The master's house is a good one, and the problem has been limited access to it. Liberalism increases access to a solid structure that can shelter and empower anyone. Equal access to rubble is not a worthy goal. Then there will be few scholars in these fields who believe our criticisms of social justice scholarship have some merits and will engage with us in good faith about us. These are the exchanges we look forward to, and the ones that can set us back on the path of having productive and ideological, diverse conversations about social justice. Buy the book, read the book, share the book to counter the insane woke mind virus that has seized control of our society and must be stopped at all costs.